Now, talking about the South, I'm very pleased to give the floor to Andrea Grazioso, who is precisely working as a senior analyst in the NATO Strategic Direction South Hub. Perhaps you should briefly say what is the purpose of this South Hub. He's an economist with a wide experience in the academic and think tank world, and he's also been a civil servant in the Italian Ministry of Defense. Andrea, up to you to address the South.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Foundation for inviting the Hub to this important and timely discussion. As for the Hub, well, it's one of the main deliverable generated by this political decision of NATO back in 2016, actually, to significantly reinforce the engagement with the southern world, with the southern neighborhood. And in the wider framework for the South, the Hub was established in order to create a bridge between NATO as an organization and our friends and partners in the South, in order to, let's say, reinforce the understanding of the South and Southern issues in the context of NATO political debate, and at the same time, in order to convey the proper messages to our friends and partners in the South about what actually NATO is. That is to say, a political alliance dealing with shared security in our wider common region, including north and south of and east of the Mediterranean. But I have been asked to address specifically the relationship between NATO and the African Union, which actually is almost 20 years old, because it was established actually in 2005. It is important to know that the same African Union is not very much older, because it was established just 2002. From the very beginning, this support was defined by three overarching principles. That is to say, African ownership, at African Union request, and in coordination with other international organizations. So this NATO support was originally triggered by the request from African Union to force logistic support in order to support African Union-led operations, peacekeeping operation in Africa. Over the time, this cooperation has evolved. In 2014, NATO established a NATO liaison office in Addis Ababa at the African Union headquarters in order to expand this cooperation. And since then, there are different strands of work, including military-to-military talks, including the persistent, enduring, I would say, logistic support to African Union-led peacekeeping operation, but there is also a training and education program where we have African officers attending NATO schools, specifically NATO schools in Oberammergau, Germany. And there is also a structural, systemic, let's say, support in order to support the let's say, staff capabilities of the African Union, providing their staff with specific training in terms of early warning and in terms of improved readiness for the Africa Standby Force, which is another important element, another important objective. I wish to mention also an additional strand of work where the Hub, the Southern Hub, is directly involved, because we are regularly working with the African Center for Study and Research on Terrorism, which is a unit part of the African Union dealing specifically with terrorism. Now, how can we do that? Because every year we have a joint activity with them, dealing with terrorism in Sahel, terrorism in other parts of Africa, etc. How can we do that? Because it's important to remember that there is no security agreement between NATO and the African Union, so we cannot exchange classified information. We can do that because the hub is not part of the Intel community. So we are the perfect bridge between NATO and the southern neighborhood exactly for this reason, because we can discuss and deal with our friends and partners about this very critical topic without touching, let's say, sensibilities and sensitivities as far as securities are concerned. Now, I used the term cooperation instead of support. The original term was support because, as I said, there is a progress in this discussion. The role of the liaison office in Addis Ababa, of course, is crucial, is pivotal. Everybody trying to assess the relevance, the depth and width of the cooperation between the African Union and NATO is looking at this office. This is understandable. I mean, every tourist entering the Sistina chapel stare at the Michelangelo's fresco with the two fingers almost touching, you know, moving life. And this is the same for the liaison office in over there. Of course, there is much more than that in Michelangelo's fresco, but also in the relation between NATO and the African Union. As for NATO, there is an ongoing political debate. Of course, the focus of NATO is the transatlantic security and specifically the security of the European continent. Why? Because war is back in Europe. Actually, war is back against Europe, against Ukraine, which has been progressing very fast in adopting the transatlantic values. So, as a matter of fact, the last meeting of foreign ministers discussed a lot about the security in Europe, Ukraine, etc. But also they had a specific, let's say, discussion on how to expand and deepen the relationship with the southern neighborhood. And they, let's say, decide to take decision on this matter during the next summit, head of state and heads of governments summit, NATO summit, that is planned for July in Washington. This is very telling because it means that the presidents and the head of government will endorse decision concerning NATO posture vis-à-vis the South. So it's a work in progress. There are different hypotheses on the table, and we will see what will be the outcome. I would say the same is happening for the African Union. Why? Because it's a very complex reality. In the analysis community, we like to talk about a system of systems. Both NATO and the African Union are system of systems, very complex. And we should take, we should acknowledge this reality. So these two realities need to move carefully. Are they converging? I would say yes. Will they deal with additional pragmatic fields of common interest, including energy? I would say yes. It takes time. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I think you made a very good point and some opening up for some possible questions about these areas that you say are the potential directions in which the cooperation with the African Union could go. And it's precisely the area where we should go in the discussion, and you should probably address that. Now, one of the things that you mentioned is the convergence, and I see that certainly there is a lot of convergence in terms of energy security and of challenges vis-à-vis what is happening with the war in Ukraine between NATO and the EU. NATO and the EU are on the same page with regard to the threats to energy security and to the challenge that represents the conflict started by Russia by its invasion of Ukraine. Now, looking at that from both the point of view of the EU-African Union relationship, which is your responsibility, because I forgot to mention that Johan van den Berg is the head of the Secretariat of the Africa-EU Energy Partnership. How can you say, what can you say in terms of energy partnership between Africa and the EU? How can this be including also the security perspective and the role of the alliance.
Yeah, thank you very much, and it's lovely to be with you. It's an honor also. I'm going to start with my message because, then if time runs out, then nothing has been lost. So, what am I here to tell you? I'm essentially here to tell you that the dystopian and chaotic African energy future as a scenario is a security nightmare to all of you. Mm-hmm. And that the harmonious and somewhat interdependent and planned African energy future that has already been adopted by all African ministers can be a scenario of dreams. So that essentially is my message. Now, how do I get there? Okay, who are we? I mean, let me first say who am I? I'm South African, so I'm the African in the room. I'm a lawyer by background, worked in climate and energy for 20 years. Africa Energy Partnership is essentially a dialogue forum between Africa and Europe. So we're deeply embedded with the European Commission, African Union Commission, African Union Development Agency. Our other members of our steering group are Italy, Egypt, COMESA, and who did I forget? Germany. And most of our money comes from the European Commission at the moment. This will also change. Let me maybe come back to that and rather go to the slide, which I think is at the heart of all of this. Now, if you read this slide, you should read it from the left to the right, and then it goes incrementally from chaos to order and from sadness to happiness. We know that there's massive energy poverty in Africa. People have already referred to this. I don't have to repeat the numbers. This ultimately leads to instability. It is associated with state failure. It leads to migration. It leads to ripe situations for warfare, for terrorism, for all sorts of things. Mm-hmm. Where is Africa trying to go? For the last many years, the International Renewable Energy Agency and the International Atomic Energy Agency have been modeling Africa's energy master plan, called the Africa's Single Electricity Market and the Africa Continental Master Plan. This was already finished last year, and it was adopted by all African ministers last year at the so-called STC meeting in Zanzibar. So what I want to tell you is, for the time being, although very few people may know it, the discussion about the energy mix in Africa is over. The decision has already been made. We know where we're wanting to go, and in 2040, if we can follow the plan, which is very difficult, then everybody will have energy. The generation in Africa will be 4 times higher. The emissions will be exactly what they are now, and the GDP will be, I can't remember, maybe triple what it is now. So the plan is there. It envisages a pan-African system that has got power pools that are connected. I think about 65% of the energy would come from renewable. And this is the lowest cost model. So this is not adapted for any climate imperatives. This is the lowest cost model. You can still tweak it to be more climate friendly, but I would say it would be very difficult to tell any African that this is not good enough, so essentially dropping energy intensity 4-fold in the next 15 years or so. The cost of this, you'd be surprised to hear, it is about 2/3 of the cost to be interconnected and doing this together as Africa than to go into the baseline and just each do it on their own. Okay? Get economies of scale, you get all sorts of good things happening. So instead of $1.9 trillion, it'll cost $1.3 trillion. What would we get out of this? Because remember, now we're talking about a pan-African system that talks to multilateralism, the international order, rules-based order, neighborliness, all these good things that we're trying to foster in Africa. We would get much higher peace and security, we would get better governance, we would get very serious climate protection, but we would also get interdependence between African countries, which not everybody wants. So where does that put us now as NATO? You want to avoid unrest, war, instability, you want to promote good order. This system has been modeled, it now has to be built. It's always far easier to model something than to build it. So, what can you do? I don't think, you have a yes, some very interesting ideas have been mentioned on what you could contribute. I very much like the idea of providing the security to whatever is built. But essentially, there's a very large overlap between your interests and the people who want the energy transition in Africa to happen. So ultimately, it's the same community, as somebody said in the previous group. So if the only thing you do is to encourage your governments and your institutions to support the African energy transition and the plans that have already been adopted, then you are doing a lot. And I would say that, and looking at the theme of today's discussion, what did you say? It was gradual and pragmatic, your collaboration with Africa, and I think as a security organization, this is okay. But I would like to say that in terms of promoting the Pan-African cohesion and bringing the energy that is the glue that will keep it together, gradual and pragmatic will not do it. The horse is running from the stable now. You see it in the Sahel and in other places. So urgency is needed. You hear it in my voice. I think maybe I can save you a minute and stop there and rather elaborate a little bit later. Thanks.
Thank you. You're 1 minute ahead of schedule. Thank you very much. So I will take the opportunity to tell you, are there any ideas about where that $1.3 trillion is going to come from?
Yeah, so I also listened in the previous session about some of the discussions on the financing. So I can tell you a very happy story. When I was still working in South Africa as CEO of the South African Wind Energy Association, in 5 years, when the regulatory regime was right, when it stopped being wrong, South Africa invested about $15 billion in renewable energy in South Africa in 5 years. That's one of the 55 countries in Africa. And all this came from...
And probably the richest.
Yeah, in some ways, the easiest place to do it was the easiest, not now, it was then. But it shows you what private sector finance can be leveraged when you align everything. And yes, there is still a government liability if the utility stops paying. And this lies on the government's balance sheet, so it's not absent. But what Europe or the international community, the Atlantic Alliance, as you call it, that those countries can do is to bring the support for the government guarantees. And if you can do that, and many other people are working at aligning the regulatory regime, the private sector will fix this.
Yeah. Thank you. But while people in the audience think about the questions that are going to ask, I want to go quickly back to the first two panelists to ask, do you see in terms of energy security what Mr. Vandenberg has outlined in terms of cooperation between African Union, European Union, and NATO, something realistic, possible? And on the same issue, from the point of view of NATO's cooperation with the African Union, do you see this as a potential positive direction in which things could evolve? Who wants to go first?
I can start. Again, NATO is not the EU. We don't do development aid. We don't do economic cooperation. This is not our area of expertise. That said, we can work, and we do work with African nations. Like, for instance, just a couple of years back, we organized this huge exercise in Algeria, where basically we helped train the Algerian army how to protect critical energy infrastructure from terrorist attacks, for instance. We work with African nations on energy projects through the Science for Peace and Security program, which also funds this conference. But looking forward, what I said about the energy transition, and perhaps I need to stress it now, our lives will change radically, okay? Within 25 years, everything will be digitalized, everything will be electrified, everything will be interconnected. You'll have more infrastructure, including undersea cables, more cables, carrying electricity, carrying data, And that kind of infrastructure will need to be protected because it is vulnerable and it will remain so. So there are some best practices that are being forged, and perhaps on the longer run, those could be shared and included in the kind of training activities that we pursue with African nations.
Thank you. And from the point of view of
I would
cooperation with the African Union?
I would say yes, but.
Okay.
Yes, but. Why but? Because we need to take 2 steps back to see things from the proper distance. Let's look at the sheer dimension of these 2 organizations. So 32 countries on one side, 55 on the other side. Almost 1 billion inhabitants one side, 1.5 billion. But in 2050, it's 2.5 billion. If we look at the geographical extension, well, if we look not only at the picture but at the movies, so dynamics is also extremely important. So if these 2 organizations converge in order to address common and shared challenges, and energy is definitely one of these, it's positive, no question. And I believe this is an area where these 2 very big organizations definitely can converge. How? So the pragmatic approach. Honestly, NATO is not fit for every kind of business. So honestly, I don't see as a matter of priority NATO troops under NATO flag protecting solar panels somewhere in Africa. This is pretty unlikely in my own opinion. So if we look at the proper, at the topic from the proper distance, yes. If we want to, let's say,
okay, it's a question of political will.
Voila.
From both sides.
Definitely, and that's why I mentioned the convergence, which require a reciprocal, let's say, agreement. And please remember the 3 principle: African ownership at African Union request. This is the cooperation support from NATO. Why? Because we want definitely to, let's say, endorse and enforce the principle of African solution to African problem.
Of course.
So it's a real partnership. It's not just support, but a real partnership means equal partnership.
Very clear, very clear. Okay, so I think we have, you wanted to add something?
Maybe I do it at the end.
Perhaps we should move and give the possibility to people from the audience to ask questions. Was everything so clear that there's no questions?
I will challenge the room if you let me.
Ambassador.
I have one basic question. Because we turn around the important topic which is at the center of the conference, combining energy security, energy supply, market regulation. But I don't hear much about the actual relationship between the NATO or such an organization and the African Union, because it is good to have what you said is perfectly pertinent. But at the core, as far as I know, but I may be behind, is that there is a military cell from NATO headquarters into the African Union Secretariat, and some kind of agreement to have a civilian representation as well. But I don't know if you have something more to add on that. Perhaps Mr. Grazioso may know something about it.
Yeah, I briefly mentioned this point. So NATO established 10 years ago a liaison office located in Addis Ababa, where there are officers from NATO acting as liaison officers. So basically conveying all the requirements and needs that African Union put forward in order for NATO to address this request. What kind of requests we receive as NATO? We keep on receiving logistics support, requests for logistic support It was in Somalia, for example, Amazon, etc. So basically, airlift, sea lift, etc. We are receiving requests for training, and that's why NATO is opening more and more courses, etc. And we are receiving requests to, let's say, support in order to reinforce and enhance African Union capabilities as far as crisis management is concerned. Early warning, standby forces, etc. As for the political side, so to have a political representative side by side with the military liaison office, this is again a work in progress, both in Brussels and in Addis Ababa. There is not a fix yet, and I'm not, let's say, privy with this kind of discussion. As you know, NATO is a very sophisticated structure, so this is not something that we deal with at the local level as we are. But we all know that this is a work in progress. Since 2016, in Warsaw, the summit in Warsaw, NATO decided that improving and deepening cooperation with the African Union was definitely an allied political goal. So we are progressing in this direction. But again, we need to be, let's say, in coordinated and synchronized with also African Union internal evolution. Let me add something more. We keep on talking about African Union, which is definitely pivotal. But there are also regional economic communities, which are also extremely relevant for understanding how African governance is evolving. And in the case of economic cooperation, including energy sector, economic communities other than African Union are also extremely important and a very important partner, prospective partner for NATO.
Thank you. There is one question there.